On to Walter. Now, some of you may have recognized that walk-up song earlier. It was Sia's hit Genius. And I think it was appropriate because Walter Isaacson has been described as the documenter of genius brains. An accomplished biographer, Walter is the professor of American history and values at Tulane University and best-selling author of a number of biographies, including on Leonardo da Vinci, Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, Steve Jobs, Henry Kissinger, and Nobel Prize-winning gene-editing biochemist Jennifer Doudna. Walter led the Aspen Institute, was the chair and CEO of CNN, and editor of Time. Under President Barack Obama, Walter was chair of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which oversees Voice of America and Radio Free Europe. This year, he was awarded the National Humanities Medal from President Biden. A proud New Orleans native, Walter attended the Isidore Newman School, a college preparatory school in the uptown section of New Orleans, where he was president of the student body. He then attended Harvard University, where he majored in history and literature and was a member of the Harvard Lampoon. He later attended Pembroke College, Oxford, as a Rhodes Scholar, where he studied philosophy, politics, and economics. Walter has spoken about the incredible intellect of his father, Irwin, who he described as a kindly, Jewish, distracted, humanist engineer with a reverence for science. And I think we can thank Irwin for his son's fascination with the genius mind. His latest biography is the perfect book for this time and window into the brilliance and pain of Elon Musk. Welcome to the Economic Club of Chicago, Walter Isaacson. Thank you, Walter, for joining us. You are one of the busiest people in America right now. Every day I turn on the TV and people are asking you about Elon Musk and other things, so we appreciate you making time for us. One would have to be living in a cave to have missed the news about Walter's new extraordinary book on Elon Musk, and everybody has a copy of that at their table, and we will get to the book in a minute. But before we do that, let's take a look at a clip from the Economic Club of Chicago circa 2012 when Elon Musk spoke to the club. Let's roll the clip.
Is there any leader or innovator or entrepreneur that you truly admire and had an influence on you, or any mentor?
Well, there's really a long list. I love reading biographies. So I think they've all had some measure of influence. I recently read, obviously the Steve Jobs biography is great, and read a number of books, both the autobiography and a number of books on Ben Franklin. I think he's pretty awesome.
So, Walter, I think
I've never seen that.
I think he was talking about your books,
Yeah.
and I think he's specifically talking about Steve Jobs and Ben Franklin. So we have to assume that he was a fan of yours before he became your subject. And what I'd like to kick off with is that true, and did you ever discuss that with him?
We definitely discussed Ben Franklin. The way we got in touch is somebody you would know. Antonio Gracias from Chicago is on his board and is an old friend of mine, and said you have to talk to Elon Musk because you've done the digital revolution with Steve Jobs and the life science revolution with Jennifer Doudna, and now we're going to have the sustainable energy and space travel Musk. So he put us together by phone, and Musk and I talked for a couple of hours. He mentioned Ben Franklin, and I said, well, if I do a book about you, a couple of things. One is I don't want it to be based on 5 or 10 interviews. I want to be able to be by your side at all times, whenever I want, for a couple of years, morning, noon, and night. I want to be embedded. And in his weird way, he just went, okay. And so I said, well, here's part 2. You don't get any control. You don't get to read it in advance. I'm not going to send you a copy before. He goes, okay. And I said, well, great. And I hung up, and I went down and talked to my wife. We had some friends over. And soon they're buzzing. I said, what happened? He said, Elon Musk just tweeted out, Walter's writing my biography. So I said, oh, man. I just got a tiger by the tail.
You can't embargo it with Elon, I guess.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. He's impulsive.
So you had unfettered access to him for 2 years. You got to see the unpredictability of his personality. You got to see his ego, and his complex personality, which I think he describes as on the autism spectrum. What surprised you most?
What surprised me most was, first of all, his unbelievable transparency. You know, I'd be there late at night with him or early in the morning walking the factory floor. And he never kicked me out of meetings, even when he was planning the new global car at 25,000, which was supposed to be a secret. And all these things are in the book. And it was he sort of has this epic history mentality that he's a player on the stage. He was very, very lonely as a kid, being on the autistic, no friends, had a little bit of a problem with emotional input-output, human emotions. And so he would read the comic books in the corner of the bookstore in South Africa and the sci-fi. And he came up with these great missions for humanity, which were, he said, in the comics, they all wanted to save the world, except for they were wearing their underpants on the outside. And they looked at me and said, but they were trying to save the world. And he almost develops this Captain Underpants mentality, where he just wants to be on the world stage, doesn't restrain himself, and it gets him in trouble when he posts things, repeats things that, you know, are hateful or harmful. But it's also that impulsiveness that gets rockets into orbit.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, and I want to come back to Captain Underpants in just a couple of minutes. But, you know, on this unfettered access, his transparency, that's great. It obviously helps you do your job. Were there any particular areas that were harder to penetrate, where he would close up?
Yeah. If you've read anything about Elon before I did my book, there have been profiles like a Rolling Stone profile that was good. Ashley Vance did a book that's good. It always says there's something he won't talk about. There's something about his childhood, and he goes dark. For almost a year of riding around with him and being with him, I'd say, tell me a little bit about his childhood. I'd say, tell me about your dad. Go dark. He'd just stare blankly. And he wouldn't talk about it. And it was, I remember the night, it was about 2 in the morning. It was just, he and I were sitting there. And once again, I just said, tell me about your dad. Now, we biographers kind of believe it's all about dad. You said it about my father, who was the smartest, nicest person I know. Elon did not have that advantage. And I said, tell me about your dad. And once again, he went silent and blank with that stare he has. But I decided I'd outwait him. I just kept silent. And maybe 4 minutes later, 5 minutes later, he started to tear up and then just poured forth, you know, how when he got beaten up in the schoolyards all the time, once he had to go to the hospital for 4 days. But he said the scars from that were minor compared to when I got home. I had to stand in front of my father, and for 2 hours, he berated me and called me a loser and took the side of the kid who beat me up and said I'd never amount to anything. And that pouring forth of the demons from his childhood was the hardest nut to crack.
Well, and he's not only the founder of many successful companies, but he's also the father of many children. So do you think that experience has impacted his view of himself in terms of the father he wants to be?
Yes, he's driven by these philosophical beliefs, which doesn't excuse some of the weird things he does, but he's driven by, we've got to get to Mars. One of his beliefs is that the low birth rates around the world, from Japan to China, Europe, Northern Africa, here, is a problem for human consciousness. This is not something I wake up every morning worrying about the future of human, but he does. And he not only has had a lot of children, his sister Tosca, a wonderful woman, not married, so he's paid for IVF treatment so she would have children. And likewise, Siobhan Zillis, who runs Neuralink, one of his companies, they've done IVF so she can have children. And it's just part of his mission. He's also extraordinarily lonely, has almost zero intimate friends. But he has this astonishingly intense bonding with his children. He always, if you've seen pictures recently, he always has X, the 3-year-old, with him at all times. One of his kids, Isaacson, is deeply autistic, has a minder with him usually, but Elon just has him around. I remember at the design studio in the Tesla when they were looking at pickup trucks, and he was looking at the he was looking at Fords and stuff, and Saxon is there and said, "Dad, why doesn't the future look like the future?" And Musk, just tears up because he's got this kid. And he immediately changed the design and said, "I want a futuristic design. I want it to look like out of a cyberpunk video game," and thus the Cybertruck. He's had 11 children, one of whom died in infancy. Of his 10 surviving children, he's close to them all except, and this is part of what's driving him in ways, his oldest surviving child was named Xavier, after his favorite character in the X-Men comics. And at one point, when I was doing the book, there's a message that says, "I'm transitioning, my new name is Jenna, but don't tell my dad." Now, you can see the psychological things that would boil up there. He got his head around the transitioning, but she became very Marxist, very anti-capitalist, thought all rich people were bad, changes her last name and refuses to have anything to do with him. And that was about 2.5 years ago when his political shift to sort of a populist alt-right happens as well. So this book has many complex layers, but the fathers and the children are all part of it.
Very, very interesting. And with respect to his relationship with others at the workplace, he's obviously been tremendously successful as a founder and a builder, but what is his approach to leadership? Does he have one? And how does he manage so many discrete businesses that are each complex in their own way?
It's really interesting because his approach to management and running a company is that the devil, as well as God, is in the details. And he will leap sequentially into an intense focus on a detail. And he'll do it for an hour or two and then move on to something else. Like right after the Twitter board decides to accept his offer. Everybody in the world's talking about that. But we're down in Boca Chica, this tiny spit of a town near Brownsville, Texas, where he has a facility to build Starship, the largest movable object ever made. And he's focused on a methane leak in the Raptor engine and the materials they're using, the grade of Inconel they're using and heat shield, and what they can do to fix the leak. And you got about 15 engineers in this conference room late at night, and they're all thinking, he just bought Twitter. But nobody would say anything, and he just focused. And then he switched to the next meeting, which is making unprotected left turns with the self-driving. And he says, it's like Napoleon would go on the battlefield with the sword and a horse. And if you're there on the battlefield fighting a particular detailed thing, the other 99% of what you have to do, the rest of your company will get it and will follow. Now, he's good at finding partners, like Gwen Shotwell, more than 20 years, has run SpaceX, Linda Yaccarino, now doing Twitter, Siobhan Zillis doing Neuralink. There's a little pattern there, which is women can handle him. Great, tough women executives I'm talking about. But he doesn't build great leadership teams. Steve Jobs, when I asked him when he was dying, and he was very, very sick, I said, "What's the greatest product you ever made?" And I thought he'd say the Macintosh or the iPhone. He said, "No, making the product's hard, but making the team that makes the product is the most important thing." So it's a team I built. And I realized that it's not about leadership. It's about creativity being a team sport or a collaborative effort. And if you look at great leaders, it's because they know how to take our founders, the greatest leadership team you might find. You have to have somebody of great high rectitude like Washington, really smart people like Jefferson and Madison, passionate people like John Adams and his cousin Samuel. But you need the person who can make a team. That's what Ben Franklin did. You see it with Intel, which is Bob Noyce is a great visionary. Gordon Moore is a great engineer, but they needed then Andy Grove to get the microchips out. I mean, I see it at United Airlines, where, I see Bret Hart there. A Scott Kirby has this passion and knows many things, but he also knows how to surround himself, with a Bret Hart or Linda Jojo or others, and it's making that team that's the most important part of leadership, and where I think Elon hasn't mastered the game.
Fascinating. So let's stick with the Jobs versus Elon comparison for a second. You got to see both up close. Do a little compare and contrast for our audience here around some of the strengths and opportunities. We hit a little.
They both have this awesome passion. I remember when I first was working on Steve Jobs, he made me walk around the backyard of his house, and there's a wooden fence that he and his dad built when he was a kid, and it faces scrublands. His father said, you have to make the back of the fence just as beautiful as the front. And Jobs said, why? Nobody's going to see it. Nobody will know. And he said, yes, but you will know. And Jobs always had that passion, even holding up shipping the original Macintosh because the circuit board inside wasn't beautiful. And his engineer said, nobody's going to see it. No. And he told him the story of the fence. That passion leads to a reality distortion field, which is, don't be afraid, you can do it. You can shave 10 seconds off the boot up time. You can delete 20% more parts. Musk has that one order of magnitude greater. I mean, he is a passionate engineer. The differentiator between Musk and Jobs, to some extent, is that Jobs cared more about the design. He'd spend 80% of his time at Apple in the afternoon walking with Johnny Ive around the design studio. And they'd worry about the chamfers and the curves on the European electrical outlet plug and what it would feel like. But once they finished designing it, they sent it off to China and had it built. And Jobs never even went to the factories in China. Musk has his desk facing the assembly line. All of his engineers have to be on the assembly line. He insourced everything after he took over Tesla, meaning he built the factory, and from the anode and cathode of the battery to the software to the drivetrain, it's all built in his own factories, because he says you're not going to innovate unless you're on the factory line every hour watching what works. So he spends 80% of his time sleeping in the factory floor, walking on the assembly line. They have red, yellow, and green lights, whether it's SpaceX or at Tesla, showing how fast things are moving through each station of the line. And he has what he calls walk to the red. And he finds the stations where it's going slow, and he just stands there until they fix it.
Very consistent with what we've heard. So you mentioned Gwynne Shotwell, and last year SpaceX CEO Gwynne Shotwell spoke to the Economic Club about how much she loves working for Elon. And she said, my Elon is not what the public makes of Elon. Now, in your book, you noted that Gwynne is one of the few people he listens to. Mm-hmm. Does he take advice from others, and if so, from whom?
Mainly technologists. It's hard to know how to turn them around, but Gwynne is an expert. There was one day we were in the conference room, and he's trying to force the future to happen all the time. And so they have what y'all know as Falcon Heavy. It's the only rocket that can lift like American communication satellites or the CIA and the Defense Department to high Earth orbit. NASA can't do it, nobody else can do it. And he said, if we keep relying on Falcon Heavy, we'll never build Starship. If you look at your book, look at the back, it's that Starship, 10 times bigger. And so he says, I'm canceling Falcon Heavy. I'm not going to allow us to shoot it off again. We're never going to do it. I see people in the meeting, they're texting Gwen. She's in her cubicle. She comes running in. She says, okay, I get it. I understand what you want to do. Here are the facts, here's the facts. And he says, no, I want to do it. Here's the And the next morning, she goes over the facts again, and he goes, okay, okay. Likewise, he was forcing the future a year ago, or all the way through 6 months ago, to have what he called robo-taxi. He wanted self-driving to work. He said, that's the goal. Our next car will have no steering wheel. And if you look in the book, there are pictures of them on the design studio with robo-taxi, this thing with no steering wheel. About 6 months ago, right before I was finishing the book, there was a meeting, and he never kicked me out of a meeting, but the CFO and a couple others are looking at me and trying to get me to go. And I look at him, and he says, no, stay. And they're presenting him with the fact that if Tesla builds a $25,000 cheap car that can beat Toyota, it's a game changer for Tesla. But it has to have a steering wheel. We can't do it. And they show him how the assembly line to do it will be the exact same one for robo-taxi, and we can make it. And finally, he just nods. And if you just inundate him with, so he changes his mind. It hadn't been fully announced yet, but it's in the book. They're going to do a $25,000 car in the factory in Mexico and in Austin.
Incredible. Well, you talked about, his ability of his companies to do things that NASA can't do, that governments can't do. You look at what has happened with Musk's decisions and Starlink meaningfully impacting the war between Ukraine and Russia. How does a single private citizen and his companies have more impact and power than some of the world's leading governments, and should that concern people?
Yeah, it should concern people two ways. One is no private citizen should be able to decide how Ukraine can attack Crimea or something. Secondly, it should concern us, which is how come he got so much power? Because nobody else could be able to do things. This year, for example, SpaceX will launch more payload into orbit than every other country and every other company combined. That's pretty surprising, but let me say this, 4 times as much as every other country and company combined, because he's made reusable rockets that can land, and the last one that landed a few days ago doing Starlink is the 19th time that rocket's been reused. Nobody's been able to make reusable rockets. So the book is about how did he gain so much power. But even he got too much when on that, he saved Ukraine because Viasat, all the satellites got knocked out, only Starlink worked, and when he gets the text messages from Zelenko and Fedorov, the vice minister, he gets all worked up and plays Captain Underpants and sends 1,000 satellites to Ukraine for them to use. But then a few months later, they were trying to do a sneak attack on Crimea, the Russian fleet, and he got all worked up because he thought this will cause a tactical nuclear response. And I remember he called me, and I try not to, I don't advise him, but at certain points I ask Socratic questions like, have you talked to General Milley? Have you talked to Jake Sullivan? And he goes like that. And he finally talks to them, and he decides, I talked to Milley about this afterwards, to transfer all the Starlink services, sell them to the Pentagon, so the Pentagon now has control over them. But you also have to ask the question, how come NASA and the Pentagon couldn't build satellites that work?
Great question, and clearly, he's had these kinds of successes, not just as Starlink, but across Tesla, Neuralink, OpenAI, and now X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. But one commonality across these businesses is that they endure years of losses in most cases before they turn a profit. Mm-hmm. And one of the things people want to know is, can some of these businesses ever generate a return, and is that important to him, or is the breakthrough the priority?
Well, obviously Tesla and now Starlink and now SpaceX are making money. The interesting thing is And I don't want to sugarcoat it because we get to a lot of things I find problematic, obviously, you'll see in the book. But he starts with the mission as opposed to the business plan. It's not to make a profit, it's because he's got so he's got this mission, we got to get humans to be multiplanetary. We got to go to Mars. Or we got to move to sustainable energy and take space travel one. He builds these rockets, the first 3 blow up, but he finally gets rockets that can get things up. And he has no business model for it. It's not, if you want to become rich, you don't start a rocket company. But then he figures out, okay, how can I now make a business that will fund getting to Mars? And he said, well, there are many things you can do with launch capacity, but he said the internet's a $1 trillion a year business. And if I can get 10% of that, I'll have a budget twice as big as NASA. So he says, all right, I need 5,000 satellites in low Earth orbit, and I can create Starlink, which is now going to also go to cell phones soon. It hadn't been totally announced. But it will take 10% of the internet business, and that's going to be very profitable. I mean, I could go down the line. I'm not sure there is a business model for what used to be called Twitter, but
well, so let's stick with that one for a second.
Up.
You know, that one is that also mission based? Is that the common link? Because what was that, a year ago? 44 billion. Some estimate the value at 19 billion now. So financially, it looks like a loser. But will it ultimately end up being a loser? Will it be a winner?
I don't give stock advice, so I mean, but I wouldn't bet too much against. First of all, it was not mission driven. It was impulsive, and he regretted it off and on every other day after he made it. I was with him in April of 2022, I guess it was, and he was just opening the Gigafactory in Texas. He had gone through, as I say, Jenna's transition. He had sold stock options because he had to, so he had a lot of cash. And impulsive, and I'm saying, because I think I have a book that has a nice happy ending, you've now gotten rockets, 33 successive launches that have landed, and you're the only person to get things in orbit. Tesla's now sold 1 million cars. Aren't you satisfied? He said, no, I don't like success. I don't like savoring happiness. I need drama. So what's happening? He says, I'm buying up Twitter. I go, this is a bad idea. I said, why? He said, well, it's an engineering problem. It's a technology company that hasn't improved its technology. I'm going, Twitter's not a technology company. It's an advertising medium that's supposed to gather eyeballs, for in a sweet environment for, Conagra brands, Vlasic pickles or whatever. But he doesn't have the feel for human emotion. So he's like, and I said, how does it fit into your 3 missions? You keep and he said, well, maybe it doesn't. Then he said, well, it's to save democracy. Now, he and I don't fully agree. We all agree free speech is good. I don't believe it's as simple as he believes.
So back to Captain Underpants, what you, I think, call his epic superhero sensibility, that's a factor. That was, even though economically, from the surface, it didn't look like a winner, there were other motives that said, let's do it.
Yeah, but I also think it was just this impulsive thing. He is addicted to Twitter as he is to video games. I mean, in 2018, he does the pedophile tweet, he does the take private tweet. So he's been addicted. Antonio, who we were talking about, was traveling with him once, and Musk was in those dark moods, the demon mode, as Grimes, his girlfriend, calls it, and doing these horrible tweets late at night. So Antonio took his cell phone, they were in hotel rooms, and put it in the room safe and punched in the code. It told Elon he wouldn't tell him what it was, so he couldn't tweet. At 3 in the morning, Musk calls hotel security to open the safe. And he starts tweeting it. So it's an addiction, and not a healthy one, but at the end of the book, and we've seen his tweets recently where he's retweeting things that I don't think he was personally anti-Semitic, but it was the type of thing that inflames that and retweets these alt-right conspiracy theories like his father believes in. And it's just really bad. But the question is, As Antonio said right after the Starship launch a few months ago, he said it'd be great if we could have this guy but have an impulse control button where he didn't unleash these dark thoughts he has. And I say, yeah, but would a Musk with an impulse control button, would a Musk who's bound be as successful as a Musk who's unhinged? Is it like Shakespeare says, we're molded out of faults? And that's the complexity of a biographer, is you can say, here's the good side, here's the bad side. But then you can't say, let me just pull this dark strand out and keep the fabric whole.
It's great. Well, we're going to take some questions from the audience in a little bit, and I'm sure there will be more there about Elon. But let's pivot now and talk a little bit about you. You grew up in Louisiana. You're the eldest of two boys. Your dad was an engineer. Your mom was in real estate. Tell us a bit about your family, your childhood, and how did it shape you professionally and personally?
You know, one of the things I write about is people who are great innovators, who are disruptors, tend to be disruptive. And they tend to have had complex, often problematic childhoods, whether it's Leonardo growing up in a small village, illegitimate, and his father won't legitimate him, and he's gay, and he's left-handed, and has these demons he has to tame, or Einstein, Jewish in Germany, or Steve Jobs, you know, abandoned by his father, adopted, readopted, and of course Elon. And they become these powerful, driven, passionate innovators. I have the blessing, but also the drawback, of having the happiest childhood you could imagine. My parents were the two nicest, smartest people I've ever known. I grew up in New Orleans where we don't really have demons, or at least we make a march in a Mardi Gras parade or something. Me and Michael Lewis grew up together, and we talk about, we end up being the observer, not the person in the arena, because we're storytellers and we had great childhoods. I grew up with Michael, a lot of other people. You talked about Newman, I hadn't even remembered. But Michael and I both went to the same high school, and fortunately, since we went there, Peyton and Eli Manning went there. So, you know, we're in the agate type of also from the Newman School. But Obama's memoirs begin saying every successful man is trying to either live up to his father's expectations or live down the sins of his father. And in his case, he says it's both. I was just very lucky. I tried to live up to my parents' expectations, but, and it's why, I mean, I love Chicago, and the secret of Chicago is it's a really small town dressed up as a really big city.
Well said.
And the people in this room are sort of the nucleus of the civic life there. And having watched Chicago so much, I mean, I can name all these, David Vitale, Greg, all these people who are part of the civic life here. About 8 years ago, after the hurricane, I said, I've now got to go back home, and I've got to throw myself into the civic life to try to save my community, which is more troubled, New Orleans, because we need that type of civic life you have in Chicago. And if you had a happy childhood, at a certain point, you want to go home.
Well said. Well, you mentioned being a storyteller. What are the key ingredients to being a great storyteller?
You know, when I was a kid, I'm sorry, I've told this probably, but there was a guy we called Uncle Walker. He was married to his wife. Anyway, he was sort of one of those Southern uncles. And I always asked Ann, his wife was married to my father's sister. Anyway, my father's brother. So I was an in-law type uncle. But his daughter Ann, who was deaf, but she could lip read, we'd go skiing, our friends, she and a few others, and hunting and turtle. And we'd say, what does your dad do? He's always sitting it was in the Bogaflaya, this bayou right north of town. He's always sitting on the dock drinking bourbon and eating hogshead cheese. What does he do? And she said, well, he's a writer. And I mean, I knew you could be an engineer like my dad or a fisherman, but a writer. And so then I read The Moviegoer. I was about 12, which was his first novel. And it was like, had all these lessons. So I said, Uncle Walker, what are you trying to teach us? What are you trying to preach in there? He said, there are two types of people come out of Louisiana, preachers and storytellers. He said, for heaven's sake, be a storyteller. This world's got far too many preachers. And so the storytelling is when you're riding alongside Elon Musk and you just see the story of Gwen Shotwell turning him around, or him fixing something, or him getting dark and Ambien and Red Bull and sending off a tweet about Fauci or something. And you just tell the story. And you make it a narrative storytelling. The criticism of my book to some extent has been, well, I didn't come down hard and make a whole lot of judgments. Well, no, I'm going to tell you the story. In the end, I hope you feel it's a bit complex, but you make your own judgments. And I think in journalism, there was a great divide when I was there between those of us who wanted to be reporters and tell you the story, and those who wanted to tell you their opinions and preach at you. And I have a lot of opinions, but I wake up in the morning and I'm not sure I agree with them all, so I don't become a preacher.
Well, you've certainly told a lot of great stories, and everybody's got a book of the latest one here, but as you think about your subjects and you think about who you want to select to write about, how do you decide, and what's the process?
Well, sometimes it seems haphazard. I did Henry Kissinger when I was very young, and after that I said, man, I'm going to do somebody who's been dead for 200 years because that was a handful. And but the thing about Kissinger is he's a great balance of power diplomat, knew how to, and I was looking for the roots of that, and it was Benjamin Franklin. And people think of him as like a doddering dude flying a kite in the rain, but he was a great balance of power diplomat. So I did him, and I realized that his science was great, but people like myself get intimidated by science these days. So I then did Einstein to try to demystify science. After I did Franklin and Einstein, that's when Steve Jobs said, I want to take a walk with you. I said, sure. He said, do me next. And I said, yeah, Franklin, Einstein, you arrogant little. I said, I'll wait 30 years or 40 till you retire. But then somebody said, if you're going to do Steve, you have to. I said, well, I didn't know he said, no, he called you the day after he was diagnosed. So I did him. And I said, why did you want me? He said, because your choices of subjects are always about people who stand at the intersection of the sciences and humanities, or the arts and technology. He said, that's where creativity occurs, and that's the great theme. And up until then, it was like, I was like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, you know, all who wander are not lost. I didn't know what I said, oh yeah, and then he said, you got to do Leonardo next, because he's the ultimate of the person at the intersection of engineering and the arts.
Well, so I was going to ask you, who was the hardest, who was the easiest subject for you to convince, and who was the hardest? Steve Jobs obviously was one of the easier ones with good reason. Who was the hardest?
To convince?
To convince.
I've been very lucky, which is, it's not ever been hard. I mean, lucky enough, I worked at Time Magazine. Eventually, people knew a little bit about who I was. So you call up, and the shyest one was Jennifer Doudna, because she's not famous, not a celebrity. Subject of my last book, she's a co-inventor of the gene editing technology called CRISPR. And she was kind of flummoxed, like, why would you write a biography of me? And I said, well, you don't have to worry. I'm not going to do a lot of interviews. I just want to be in your lab. I want to learn how to edit human genes. I want to watch you, you know, for a couple of years. And I just enjoyed enormously getting to know her. And she just said, okay, you know, softened up.
Now, is there any subject that you've just said, I got to do them, and you just can't get access to them?
Well, one subject that I've wanted to do, partly as a paean to my hometown and partly as a meditation on everything from creativity to race to diversity, is Louis Armstrong. I grew up in the neighborhood where he grew up. I played jazz. I once saw him play, actually a couple times. And so I spent 2 years working on a book on Louis Armstrong. I went up to Corona, Queens, listened to all the tapes, read all of his letters, his diaries. He's a fanatic writer. And after 2 years, I shouldn't say 2 years, maybe a year and a half, I knew everything there was to know about Louis Armstrong, except for who he was. I didn't know why he was happy. I didn't know why he was smiling. I didn't know if he liked white people. I just didn't know. And I put it aside.
Awesome. Well, we're going to pivot to one last section before we open to the audience, and I have time for one question in this section. So I'm going to cut to this one, Walter. The Economic Club's mission is to give forum for civil discussion on the most pressing societal and business issues of the day. On a national and global perspective, that seems increasingly difficult as people continue to become more and more divided. What is the key to getting the country past this partisanship and become more united?
Boy, I wish we knew. And I remember when Obama was first elected, he said, "Don't worry, the fever will break." And then it didn't. It got worse. And I think there are quite a few reasons. One is in my old trade, which was the media, which is it used to be technologically, if you were running Time Magazine or running CBS News, you had to get a broad audience. You had to get a third of the audience, half the audience to succeed. The technology made it so that you can narrowcast, that from talk radio to cable TV, you just needed to get 10% of the audience and have the passionate people stay with you. And that became a formula for very divisive Fox, MSNBC, blogosphere, Twitter feeds. And you measure it by engagement. And another word for that almost is enragement. If you enrage people, if your algorithms get them upset and play to their resentments, it's a good business model. So that's one of 20 reasons, from gerrymandering to perhaps money in politics, that did it. I think there's an enormous hunger among 70% of this country. You could get 70% of this country to agree on 70% of all issues, to find a common ground. Probably 80% you could. And I think there's a hunger among those people for smart civil politicians again, which we used to have up until recently. I mean, if you looked at, Romney and McCain running against Obama, it was fine. The resentments that are now played to have just so badly poisoned our politics. But it's a global. I just came back from Holland. I was there for Geert Wilders' surprising election win, and came from. It's happening all over. And I will say this, which is on us, meaning the people in this room and you and me, is we understood the virtues of globalization and success and technology and outsourcing and financial instruments. And there was a great meritocracy, but there were a whole lot of people who got left behind and are deeply resentful that we didn't get it. And so I think that was on us too, and especially those of us in the media, but those who've been successful, it's not just the rich, poor thing, it's the people who feel I got left out of this past 20 years of economic success around the world. That globalization and free trade and automation and outsourcing was great for a whole lot of people. And I can get a great flat screen TV set at Walmart on a Sunday that's very cheap, but it means that on Monday morning I don't have an early morning bus to take to the Maytag plant where I can be proud and send my kids to college.
Well said. Well, we now have a few questions from our audience members, so I'm going to pivot and turn this way. The first question we've got is from Omar Rahman, a longstanding club member. And I think I see him stepping up.
He's
to
in the
mic.
spotlight.
So Omar,
I
take
am
it
in
away.
the spotlight. So I have a question for a topic that you dedicate a chapter to in your book, artificial intelligence. My question is, having spent time with Elon, do you think he genuinely believes that AI is an existential threat to humanity within, say, the next decade or so?
Yes. And he, in that corner of the bookstore as a friendless child, read all of the Isaac Asimov's robot books, including the final one with the 0th law about no robot shall harm humanity. And he became existentially worried that our machines could turn on us. And for 15 years, whether it's Neuralink, which is implanting chips in the brain to be able to communicate with machines so we have a symbiosis, whether it was starting OpenAI with Sam Altman to keep it both open and nonprofit, which obviously Sam didn't continue. And at the end of the book there are a couple chapters in the book. And one of the things about buying Twitter, which he didn't think of in April when he started to buy it, but as we were going towards the closing of the deal, he said something in Louisiana we call lagniappe, which is a little something extra thrown in. He said, I realized that AI, especially because ChatGPT was about to come along, he said, that's not hard, building the algorithm. What's hard is having the data feed it can train on. And he said, what's the best data feed for the hive mind of humanity in the current instant? And he said, it's Twitter. So he cuts off the API to Twitter. Nobody can scrape those. And he has 1 billion tweets a day. And that's one reason he starts XAI, his AI company. The other great data feed is there are about 1 billion frames of video per day from Tesla cameras. If you have a Tesla, you know it has 8 cameras. And you probably haven't thought about it, but every bit of that camera data is sent back to Tesla in their supercomputers. And so he is trying to create real-world AI, which will combine large language model generative predictive intelligence with robots that can walk on a factory floor or cars that can drive. And is he truly driven by these missions? I think he keeps saying it so much over and over again. At least he's convinced himself, and he's half convinced me.
I guess we can look forward to Elon the AI then in the near future.
Thank you, Omar. Our next question comes from Desiree Moore, who also happens to be the chair of our questions committee. So,
hey.
Desiree, take it away.
You pulled a little fast one there, chair of the questions committee.
Well, this one's an easy one. The upcoming presidential election, will it be, in your view, a test of our democracy, of the infrastructure of our democracy? What implications will this upcoming election have on who we are, the fabric of who we are?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is obviously yes. I mean, what is at stake here, and is at stake, whether it be in Hungary or Holland or other places happening, is can you believe that democracy really has a deep moral value and is worth fighting for? Because it's actually messier than an autocratic system. And I think if people need to read another book of mine, read Ben Franklin so you understand the moral underpinnings of why we have free speech, why we have tolerance of religion, and why we have democracy as a guarantor of that. So I think this is the question not only of the 2024 election, but of the world today. When we thought the end of history had come and democracy was the final thing, no, we now are tested.
Thank you, and thanks for an excellent discussion.
Thank you, Desiree. Excellent. All right, Walter, we're down to the stretch run here. This is called the lightning round, which I've done many times.
I haven't been lightning enough.
So who is the person that you've written about that in the end you believe you'll be able to say they had the greatest impact on humanity?
That's a good question. You know, Musk is close in terms of after GM and Ford get out of EVs, and he brings us that era. And once again, after we ground the space shuttle, quit going to space, he pushes us there. I also think that Einstein truly defines the era of physics that we're living in now. And had he not come along, it would have taken a long time for general relativity and quantum mechanics to have been figured out.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned that you would have loved to have done Louis Armstrong. There have been rumors about Marie Curie.
Yeah.
Anything you want to break tonight? Any news?
Well,
on
sure.
what's
I
coming
mean,
next?
first of all, you know, as I said, after Steve Jobs, it's like somebody's been dead 500 years. After Elon, I do want to go into the Wayback Machine. And I just mentioned about Einstein, but the other great foundation of science today is basically that chemistry is just physics. It's how electrons go around a nucleus and how they can radiate sometimes. And the person who discovers radiation and names it is Marie Curie, who couldn't go to university in Poland because she was a woman. So she has to go to what's called the underground university, where women are secretly taught, and she decides to do physics and chemistry, becomes the first woman professor at the Sorbonne, but still not elected to the Académie Française because they won't accept women. When her husband Pierre dies of radiation, of being hit by a car, but radiation poisoning too, she goes into deep grief, but then has an affair with his prize student, Paul Langevin, the physicist, good friend of Einstein. And so she and Langevin are up in Brussels with Einstein, and she gets the telegram that she's won the second Nobel Prize. This time, nobody ever has, even to today, has won 2 Nobels in science. But the day after that, the story of her affair with Paul Langevin breaks because Langevin's wife finds the letters, becomes a tabloid thing. And so the Swedish Academy says, you shouldn't come accept the Nobel, it's too much of a scandal. And she says, if I were a man, you wouldn't have said that. And she goes in and she accepts it. So it's a pretty interesting story.
All right. What is the professional achievement that you're most proud of? Could be anything. News story, a position with an organization, a book, anything else.
This is, I mean, Leisha was saying, oh, somebody should write. I said, no, I'm an observer. So I don't think we should fall prey to the conceit that we observers are also people in the arena. So I haven't really thought about that, sorry.
That's great. Well, who is your favorite author?
Well, besides Walker Percy, for obvious reasons. I'll tell you the one who first got me figuring out how to be a storyteller. There's a guy named T. Harry Williams, you may not know, but he wrote a biography called Huey Long, and I was young, had finally finished The Moviegoer, and so I decided I didn't know writing biography, I was a kid, I didn't know you could do it. And it was totally amazing to me that you could write about our life and times through the people who make it. So what Time magazine used to do, especially when I was editor, always put a person on the cover because it's a way to do it. And what T. Harry Williams did in that book was Huey Long was a little bit like Elon Musk in that he was controversial, people hated him, people loved him, he was problematic. But at the very beginning, the first paragraph is, real quickly, I'll try to do it, which is Huey Long from upstate Louisiana, Protestant upstate, is going down to Cajun country, which is all Catholic, and his campaign manager reminds him about Catholic stuff. So Huey gets up there and tells the story. When I was young, I'd get up early on Sunday, hitch our horse to the wagon, I'd bring my Protestant grandmother to church, then I'd come back home and re-hitch the horse to the wagon and take my Catholic grandmother to Mass. And the campaign manager says, Huey, we didn't know you had a Catholic grandmother. He says, hell, we didn't even have a horse. And you laugh, but you realize he's a liar, he's a rogue, he's charismatic, and T. Harry Williams is able to tell you all that without preaching at you or telling you what you need to think. He just says, let me tell you a story. And that is an Arthur Haley who did Roots. That was his mantra, and I have it over my desk. a simple card that says, let me tell you a story. Because whenever I'm trying to convey something, how Musk changes his mind, how Jobs got something done, why, it's, let me not try to explain it to you. Let me tell you a story.
Excellent. All right. Last one, Walter. I'm a food guy, so I've got to ask you this. When in New Orleans, favorite restaurant, favorite meal?
I got to get you down there because Conagra needs to bottle some of the magic there and put it on shelves. I'm going to do two, if you don't mind. Every Sunday night, including this coming Sunday when I'm in town, Kathy and I go to Galatoire's. We go to the same table. We tend to order the same thing, which is whatever the best Gulf fish of the day is with crab meat on top. And that's a magical place to me ever since my grandparents used to take me there and we sat at that same table. The most fun restaurant, I think you and I talked about, is Mosca's, which is a roadhouse just across the Huey P. Long Bridge. And Mama Mosca used to sit there smashing the garlic and making oysters Mosca. So my daughter, when she comes in town next week with her boyfriend, they love Mosca's and we're going to go there.
Awesome. You all make a note of that. We can freeze it. Okay. Walter, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been a true treat for our members here in person and online. It's been a special night. Happy holidays to everybody who's tuned in, and the meeting is now adjourned.
And applause for a great moderator. Thank you.
Thank you.